So in the previous video, we introduced price discrimination, which is charging different prices to different groups of customers for exactly the same product. And that difference in price has nothing to do with a difference in cost of provision of the product or service. And we talked about why a firm might price discriminate. And we showed that a firm can increase their profits by practicing smart price discrimination, by charging a higher price to customers with lower elasticities of demand and charging a lower price to customers with higher elasticity of demand. Now let's look at the effect of this on the market as a whole, not just for producers. So for producers, we do see that practicing price discrimination will increase their producer surplus. They earn higher profits. And consumers, do consumers benefit? At first glance, you might think, no, consumers aren't benefiting because it means that producers can hike prices on certain consumers. But what it also means is that consumers have more options. More units are being offered for sale, and more trading actually occurs. So if you're able to charge that higher price to the customers with high inelasticity, but on the flip side, you offer discounts to folks with more elastic demand, those discounts are allowing more individuals to benefit from trade in the market. More folks will come into the market because of those discounts. And in certain cases, we could actually see higher overall consumer surplus as well as higher producer surplus. And as a whole, overall in a market, welfare increases and deadweight loss decreases when firms are able to practice price discrimination as opposed to charging a single price, particularly in a monopoly or in a market where firms have some market power. So one way to look at how this all shakes out is to look at an extreme sort of price discrimination. That's perfect price discrimination. Perfect price discrimination happens when the firm is able to sell the same good or service at a unique price to every customer, right? Each customer who walks through the door gets the same product, same good or service, but each customer gets charged a different price from each other customer. Ideally, the firm charges a price equal to the consumer's maximum willingness to pay. So if you are an all-knowing firm, right, salesperson, and it's almost like if your customers would walk in the door and tell you what they're willing to pay for something, you'd charge them that, right? That's the most perfect form of price discrimination, is if you're able to tell what your customers are willing to pay, you charge them that, right? Does this happen? Well, you can probably tell from the fact that it's called perfect price discrimination that it doesn't happen perfectly. Nothing happens perfectly, but we do get close in certain types of markets. So for example, a car dealership or a jewelry store, or really anywhere where haggling happens, right? What's happening when you walk in and you haggle with a car dealer? You walk in and you say, I like this car and I'm willing to give you X dollars for it, right? Did you tell the dealer your maximum willingness to pay? Probably not. Not if you're smart, you didn't. But what's the dealer do? The dealer comes back and says, how about you give me this price, right? They give you a little bit higher offer, right? And you go back and forth. What's the dealer doing? The dealer is pulling you up from the original price you said out loud. They're going to go back and forth in an attempt to get you to get closer and closer to your actual maximum willingness to pay, right? And that's the goal with any of these haggling sorts of sales, is that they're going to get you to reveal your maximum willingness to pay, or at least something very close to it, by pulling you up from whatever you did reveal when you first came in. So let's look at perfect price discrimination and how it shakes out in terms of market welfare. So here's a monopolist, right? We know it's a monopolist because they have a downward sloping demand curve and a downward sloping marginal revenue curve that's beneath it, right? Our marginal cost curve in this case, just to keep things simple, is horizontal rather than being, remember, marginal cost and supply are the same thing, but rather than being our typical upward sloping marginal cost and supply curve, we're going to keep the calculation simple, keep our triangles pretty simple, we're going to say we have a flat marginal cost, right? So if this is a single price monopolist, they will choose their level of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, 100, and charge a price equal to the height of the demand curve at that level of output. And this area B, will be their profit, right? The space between the price and the cost of producing their product, right? If, however, you're able to practice perfect price discrimination, right? If you're able, instead of charging everyone $300, if you knew that the first person who walked in your door was this guy way up here that was willing to pay this much, you'd charge him that much. And the next guy, you charge him that much. And the next guy, you charge him that much. And in that way, for the first 100 customers, you'd actually charge them, or maybe 99, because the 100th customer is the one who's willing to pay 300. For those 99 customers before, you'd be charging them their highest willingness to pay, which is something greater than 300. And you'd earn all of that extra revenue off of them, right? And then, would you stop at 100 customers? No, not if you knew you could price discriminate. So you would keep selling until your customer's willingness to pay became lower than your cost to provide, right? Because as long as even this customer way down here with a pretty relatively low willingness to pay, their willingness to pay is still higher than what it costs you to provide the service. And so if you can charge them their willingness to pay, you'll do it, because it still means, though you might not make a bunch of profit off of them, you'll make some. And so you end up, if you're able to perfectly price discriminate and charge everyone their highest willingness to pay, then you'll keep getting folks in the door and keep charging them according to the demand curve until this point where the demand curve crosses the marginal cost curve, and you'll end up with this area C of additional profits from attracting more customers into the door than you could with a price of 300. This this dotted line should be over here. So, but the point being that under a perfect price discrimination, you're going to keep selling until the customer's willingness to pay dips below your cost of provision, because you can sell to everyone for their highest willingness to pay. And when you do that, you get to walk away with all of this A plus B plus C area of surplus. So speaking of surplus, let's look at how this all shakes out, comparing market structures. So in perfect competition, what will we do, right? So in perfect competition, the market will go to a point where where quantity supplied equals quantity demand, right? The market equilibrium, which in this case is right here, because remember that marginal cost is the same thing as supply. This is not our supply curve we're used to that's upward sloping, but that's okay. We still just look for the place where the supply curve and the demand curve cross. It's right here. If we were in a perfectly competitive market, then this market would be providing a quantity of 200 and charging a price of 100, right? At that market equilibrium point that we're used to looking for, where supply crosses demand. In that case, when we sell 200 and we charge a price of 100, how much consumer surplus is there? Remember, consumer surplus is the difference between consumers' willingness to pay, which is given by the demand curve, and the price they actually pay, which is given by the market price. And so in this case, if this were a perfectly competitive market, then the space between the price and the demand curve is this entire triangle here, A plus B plus C. So consumer surplus is A plus B plus C in a perfectly competitive market that looks like this, right? What about producer surplus? So producer surplus is the space between the supply curve and the price. In this case, where we have a flat supply curve, the supply curve is equal to the price, so there's no space between the supply curve and the price in a perfectly competitive market here with a flat supply curve, right? And so there's no producer surplus. The producer gets no surplus in a perfectly competitive market where we're charging a price equal to the market equilibrium price and a quantity equal to the equilibrium quantity. There's also no deadweight loss because we are all the transactions that could occur are occurring. We're going all the way up to that market equilibrium here, and anywhere beyond that would mean that we'd be selling for a lower price than we want to. We'd be losing money. And if we stopped anywhere early of that, we'd be losing money as well because we'd be losing out on transactions that could occur. So there's no deadweight loss, and the total welfare then is consumer surplus plus producer surplus, A plus B plus C. This we're used to doing. We've done this welfare problem before when we've talked about perfect competition. We've also done this before for a single price monopoly. So if this same market were, instead of being perfect competition where we come all the way to where supply equals demand, if this market were a single price monopolist, then that monopolist is going to choose a level of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So they're only going to sell 100 seats or items, seats on their plane. I think this is an airplane example. And they're going to charge a price equal to the height of the demand curve, right? And so if that is the case in a single price monopoly where we're selling 100, a quantity of 100, and we're charging a price of 300, where is consumer surplus? Consumer surplus in that case is the space between the price and the demand curve. So it's just triangle A, right? And producer surplus is the space between the price and the supply curve, but only to the place where transactions occur, right? Remember, there's no surplus past a quantity of 100 in this case because there are no transactions happening past a quantity of 100. And so the producer surplus is just this box, box B, the space between the price of 300 and the supply curve, which is this flat marginal cost curve, right? What about deadweight loss? If it's a monopolist who charges a single price, then they will stop transactions here at 100. That's not efficient because remember, if this were a perfectly competitive market, we would still have this many more transactions occurring. This, area C, is deadweight loss. These are transactions that could have occurred but aren't occurring because we have a monopolist who's charging a higher price than the market price. Right? Total welfare in this case is consumer surplus plus producer surplus. It's A plus B. Lastly, let's look at this market as though it is a monopolist who is practicing perfect price discrimination. So remember, now under perfect price discrimination, the monopolist is going to charge every customer exactly what that customer is willing to pay, right? And they will keep doing that as long as the customer's willingness to pay is higher than their cost of provision of the service, higher than their supply curve, their willingness to accept. So, if the monopolist is charging every single customer exactly what that customer is willing to pay, then how much consumer surplus is there? The answer is 0. So remember, consumer surplus is the space between what a consumer is willing to pay and what they actually have to pay. And if the firm is practicing perfect price discrimination, then they're charging the consumer exactly what the consumer is willing to pay. And so there's no surplus for that consumer. There's no space between what they pay and what they're willing to pay, right? On the other hand, how much surplus does the producer get in this situation? The producer walks away with surplus equal to the space between what they actually receive every time they sell their product and their lowest willingness to accept, or their supply curve. And so for this guy way up here who was willing to pay this high price, the producer gets this much surplus off of that guy, right? And the next guy, the producer gets this much surplus off of that guy. The next guy, the producer gets this much, right? And so in this case, the producer surplus is actually the space between the demand curve and the supply curve, because their willingness to sell is their supply curve, and the price at which they actually sell is the height of the demand curve, because for each customer that comes in, they're charging a different price. They're charging whatever they're willing to pay, which is given by the demand curve. So the producer surplus under perfect price discrimination is A plus B plus C. This is all surplus that's going to the producer because they're able to figure out exactly what their consumers are willing to pay and charge them that. And now what about deadweight loss? Again, there is none. We actually have the exact number of transactions occurring under perfect price discrimination as we would under perfect competition. So remember, deadweight loss happens when we have the wrong number of transactions occurring, right? If we did something like the Monopolist, charged too high of a price and stopped our transactions early or something like that. But we haven't done that. Under perfect price discrimination, we are selling all the way to the point where no one's willing to buy anymore for the price that we're willing to sell, right? And that means that we have maximized possible happiness or surplus in this market. There is no deadweight loss under perfect price discrimination. And you'll notice that when you look at the total amount of welfare under perfect price discrimination. It's consumer surplus plus producer surplus, and it's exactly equal to the amount of welfare under perfect competition. And remember, this is sort of our gold standard for efficiency. This is our perfectly efficient market with no deadweight loss. And if we can reproduce that same level of efficiency, that same level of welfare, regardless of how we do it, this is also an efficient market. So if you remember from our original discussion of how economists measured efficiency, it's just maximizing surplus. I don't care if the consumer gets all the surplus, or if the producer gets all the surplus, or if, in the case of other perfectly competitive markets where the supply curve is not flat, then we may see producers and consumers sharing the surplus. But I don't care who gets it. What I care about is that it's maximized. That the total amount of surplus that can be had is being had. And that's the case whether we're in perfect competition or whether we're in perfect price discrimination. These are both examples of efficient markets, just with the surplus going to different places. So back to harp on this as a general rule for price discriminating with two consumer groups. What we do is we charge a higher price to the inelastic group and a lower price to the elastic group. So if we have a couple of groups, then we separate them by their willingness to pay. And those who are willing to pay more, we charge more to them. Those who are not willing to pay as much, those who are more elastic and might leave if we charge them a higher price, we charge a lower price to them to get them to come in the door, right? And this is just stretched to the extreme when we're talking about perfect price discrimination, where we charge every customer, not just groups of customers, we charge every customer exactly what that customer is willing to pay.